Now we basically stay on topic with Alan Melby's presentation on translation labels. Alan, I don't want to rush you. But if we can, the floor is all yours.
Is the microphone on?
Yes.
Well, I certainly am pleased with the way the discussion went this past hour. I made a couple notes as we go through this. When people talked about tagging, that would be in this presentation attaching a label, and then the question of workflow. We call that process here, but essentially the same thing, just so you can connect the discussion. So labels on translation output. This is the evolution of a presentation that I've made and changed as I've gotten feedback over the last 6 months or so. The roadmap for this presentation is as follows. First of all, these labels, which I will reveal shortly, proposed labels. We decided early on, by the way, this project began in November 2021 and has involved discussions with hundreds of people to get to where we are now. We decided the labels needed to be standardized so that everyone would recognize them easily, especially since it's consumer-oriented for end users, not translation professionals, to identify what kind of translation they're looking at. We selected a standards body, ASTM International, which is older and bigger than ISO, but not nearly as well known. For various reasons, we chose that. The next point is the key distinction. This is not how we started out. We started out just human versus machine, but it turned out to be a little more complicated than that. And we're now at the point where the key distinction, the top level distinction by consensus in the group working on this, is whether it's been verified or not by a qualified professional translator. Third, who should care about these labels? I'll talk about that. The factors in the labels, there are 3 main factors: the process used or workflow, the qualifications of the translator involved, and that actually connects with EMT, because the 6 areas of competence that we propose are compatible with the areas of competence in the EMT requirements for programs. And then accountability. Who is responsible for errors of correspondence in the translation? You can tell if there's an error of fluency. If you can't read it, if you can't understand it, if it's ungrammatical, you don't need to know the source language. So when we say correspondence errors, it's errors between the correspondence between source and target, which if you don't know the source language, you cannot figure out yourself. That's why you're looking at a translation, at least usually. And who takes responsibility for those errors? And then next, what are the next steps as we see them? Adoption. I think we're ready for adoption by some brave early adopters. And it's not a high-risk adoption. Education of the public, well, within the translation community as well. And finally, and this actually relates to a comment made a few minutes ago, we believe that the labels will enhance visibility of the profession of translation. Actually help more people think, oh, professional translator, there still, or ever were, professional translators? Yes. So that's what we'll be talking about the next few minutes. So what do we mean by verified? We're using it in a very broad sense. Either it's been produced by a translator and then self-revised or self-checked, depending on what terminology you use for that, or it was produced by someone or something other than a qualified professional translator, post-editing of machine translation, full post-editing. I realize this is controversial. Full post-editing falls under verified. Also, revision in the ISO 17100 sense. One translator revising another, or self-revision in the United Nations translation context. That's also verification. We're using it. We found that after trying a number of terms, verification works with the general public without a lot of explanation. They kind of get an idea of what it means. Oh, this has been professionally verified. Okay. And we include all of this under verified. However, we're not saying that they're all equal. Once you know that it's been verified, you should be able to ask for more information about the exact process used if it makes a difference to you, whether it has been initially produced by a translator and then revised by another translator, or whether produced by machine and revised by a translator. If that's important to you, you should be able to go down the tree and see what kind of verification was done. The labels. Here are the labels as of January of this year. Professionally verified translation and unverified translation at the highest level. That's it. That's the key distinction that has settled out of all these discussions. Along with it, we need a certification mark. A certification mark is related to a trademark, but substantially different. For example, there's a certification mark for sustainable seafood, where a third party has certified that the seafood you're consuming was produced in a sustainable way and is not depleting the particular ocean or farm or whatever. We tried to get the acronym PVT, Professionally Verified Translation, to be protected. We paid for an intellectual property attorney to investigate this, and they gave us an opinion, a written opinion, not likely that you would be able to protect PVT. They suggested we add another letter to make it more distinctive. We had a big debate, and fortunately came to a consensus to add a Q to the end. And we then received an opinion that this is likely going to be protectable, and has been submitted to the US Patent and Trademark Office, and we're trying to find a corresponding organism in Europe that can also protect it. But we can already use a TM with it, trademark, to say, hands off, it's been submitted for protection. Who should care? Consumers. We're hoping that over time, consumers will care. They'll say, well, just a minute. I saw the other day, I saw a translation and it had a mark on it, a character mark, PVTQ, and an explanation, professionally verified translation. And then another one I saw, unverified translation. That was very helpful information to me. And they'll start requesting this from the publisher. We also think that providers, translators, starting with individual professional translators, should attach PVTQ to their work and submit it to the requester. Requester, if they trust that translator, why would they hire them if they don't? Would then pass that on until it gets to the publisher, and then it would be attached to the document, web page, a footnote, whatever, that goes to the consumer. And here, this ties in very well with what we were just saying. We can't instantly correct your 30 years of translation memory, but going onward, the data that is used to train a new system, you can say, well, do we want to restrict the training data, the bilingual training data, to professionally verified translations? Of course, you'd have a smaller training set, but a much cleaner one. So we think that these three groups should care. This is kind of a summary, a tree. At the top, you have translation output of all kinds. Professionally verified translation, which may or may not have this certification mark attached, and unverified translation. An unverified translation, you've got, of course, raw machine output. And there, it's a bigger question than just translation output. It's AI-generated content, and that's being worked on. But this one underneath to the left, this is what was the shocker over about a year ago, when a master's thesis that I was involved in, supervising, demonstrated scientifically, very carefully, that a translator working to become a certified translator, taking the exam, who did not do well, their output was not clearly distinguishable from raw machine output. So you can't just say a human was involved. You've got to say a qualified professional. This is how the discussion has evolved. So what do you do? What's the action item now? If you're a publisher, in a very broad sense, if you make documents available to a set of users, and many of you represent organizations that we would call publishers of translation. This does not apply to European official documents which do not have a source language, even though behind the scenes they do. Officially, they're all on an equal basis. Well, they're not translations. There are no translations, but those can be trusted. So setting that case aside, any of you who publish translations, we're saying it's ready. It's time to start using PVTQ. And providers, translation service providers, I'll be talking with Gala next week in Montreal, and a lot of them are large translation service providers. I'm going to tell them it's ready. It's time to start using this label. And then anyone, and now I'm here working with Pascal, who spoke about health of translators. Part of the mental health of translators is being able to believe in a future. And we, in the Labels Project, believe that having these labels start to appear will raise awareness among consumers and actually make the profession more visible and more respectable. Not everyone can be a professional translator. Oh my goodness, what is that? What does that involve? So we, if you want to keep up to date on this, you can point to the QR code, or you can write down the the URL, tranquality.info. This will take you to a page on the Tranquality site, which is regularly updated with events. And you can also contact me directly, alan.melby@fit-ift.org. And my slogan for this whole thing is that labels, it's like, as we say sometimes in my circles, it's a no-brainer. Everybody wins, except those who don't want to be transparent about what they're doing. But everyone who wants transparency and wants visibility for the profession wins by using labels. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Now, please take to Slido. We will use Slido again for the questions to have an even playing field. While you Slido up, I have a question, Alan, well, a practical one. You gave the example of the sustainable fishing You said somebody's fishing, and then there's somebody else who certifies that they're doing it correctly. In the context of the labels, the translation labels, who would be the certifier?
Who would manage the certification mark?
Who would say, yes, you are a professional translator and you can have the trademark?
We went through
field.
3 stages on this. First, we gave first right of refusal to ASTM International. They manage 1 or 2 certification marks in very high-profile industries such as protective helmets for firefighters and that kind of thing. They went and deliberated and they said, no, we do not take this, we will not take this on. We suggest you go to a translation-related organization and see if they will manage the certification mark. We went to IA to fit. They said, well, come back to us. Maybe we can help in the next mandate. We're too busy right now getting ready for plug the World Congress here in Geneva in September. Please come and join us. And then we went to the American Translators Association. They almost bit on it. And then they said, you know what, for a sustainable management, we want to turn it to a nonprofit, which will make an official statement that this will be a long-term effort. And currently it's being managed by LTAC Global, which is a nonprofit 501c3 in the US. That doesn't mean anything here, but it means it's a tax-deductible charity, and they are currently managing the mark. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Ish. I still have more, but I don't want to ask all the questions. I'm going to give people a chance to Slido. Pascal, I think you should know all the answers because you're kind of from the same team. Alain, could you please distinguish for the audience the labels verified and unverified from the translation grades, low, medium, high?
Good. Thank you for this question. The grades are something that you discuss, well, what's left of them. They've evolved. They've morphed into service levels. We don't really talk about grades anymore. But service levels are something that is discussed upfront before a translation project begins. What kind of translation do you want? Labels are attached after, during post-production, and whether there was a discussion of grades or service labels, service levels up front, the labels are attached according to what finally ended up happening. What process was used, whether the person doing the verification is qualified, a qualified translator, and who is taking responsibility. And so it's independent somewhat of the grades. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. You convinced at least one person in the room with your elevator pitch. That's great. But Gwen had a question. Qualified professional translator. Why necessarily translators? A subject matter expert with adequate drafting skills can also produce a verified translation. Researchers often translate other researchers' work, yet they are not translators. Do we trust those people?
Well, Gwen and I are friends, at least we were. And I think that the answer is that translator is used in a broad sense, just like verification is used in a broad sense. Translator is someone who is qualified to produce a target language document which meets the agreed on specifications. And if they're qualified, they have the 6 areas of competence that we have identified as being in common among the EMT requirements for what they teach, ISO 17100 list of competences, and the ASTM F2575 list of competences or competencies, depending on what dialect of English you speak. And they're all pretty much compatible. Does that help at all? Yeah. Here, this, you're managing this.
I'm trying to manage this, but I have a question. as a follow-up to Gwen's question, so how do I qualify as a professional translator? What do I have to do? Because usually when you have ISO or any standard, you have to jump through a number of hoops and get an approval of some sort. How do I get into the good category?
This will be a huge headache for LTAC Global, and we are just beginning on this. We will use existing qualifications for the very small percentage of language combinations that are covered by section 3.1.4 of ISO 17100 as revised in 2017, which requires a university degree or experience. We'll use that criterion, but that only applies if you look at the world and thousands of languages. It only applies very narrowly. So outside of that, we'll have to use the areas of competence, and we'll have to rely, hopefully, on FIT, the International Federation of Translators, and their professional associations around the world to help with this huge project.
You said it was very easy to adopt it. I have my doubts, but let's come to Nikolai's question, which is interesting. Isn't PVTQ misleading for users? They might start thinking that it means the translation is top quality, which is not necessarily the case. Once they found out that this label is not a synonym for top quality, this might erode the confidence and progressively devaluate the label.
This is a knife in the heart type of a question. I am a certified translator, certified by the American Translators Association. And I've been working in a project where we're looking at the certification exam and the results of it. Of course, you're right. It doesn't say it's top quality, whatever that is. But we're in a different world now. We're in a world where many people are wondering why they should even try to involve a human at all. Why shouldn't they just use the machine? There was a comment which yesterday I was going to ask how serious it was. Well, the machines are somehow more predictable, and you might get a different result from a translator if they have a headache that day. Maybe we should prefer machines. Well, of course, this just makes me shudder. But especially since my previous position, now I'm chair of the North American region of FIT. Before I was vice president of FIT Global. How can we navigate this difficulty? First of all, it's a high-level distinction. At the highest level, it's information for you. Has it been verified by a professional translator? Yes or no? If that's relevant, use the information. If you wonder, well, how good was this translator? Ask for more detail. Go down the tree. Look all the way down to the exact process used, the qualifications. And if you're really interested, who was the translator? You should be able to dig down and get more information. But this is a high-level, consumer-oriented distinction at the very top. And we believe, after trying many top-level distinctions, this is the one that will be the most useful over the next years. But I'd be glad to debate that.
Okay. I think you answered in part at least the next question, but building on Dieter's question, shouldn't a certification body be responsible for ensuring compliance with PVTQ guidelines and standards?
There'll be two stages of compliance checking. First of all, to get things rolling, people will do self-certification, and then there'll be a global reporting mechanism for someone who says, you know what, I got this translation, and this is related to the previous question. It's garbage, and it's marked PVT, it's labeled PVTQ. What's going on? There'll be a reporting procedure, and the central body will investigate. Later on, when it's really much more implemented by a lot of publishers, there'll be an application procedure for additional organizations to go through a certification process.
Good. A question from Francis. Where does light post-editing of machine translation fall under? Does it?
This allows me to bring in my favorite branch of translation studies, functionalism, and the implementation of functionalism in an ISO standard, 11669, and an ASTM standard, F2575, where you say quality is meeting those requirements, those specifications that have been agreed on in advance. And if the audience, and it includes the intended audience, if for this audience and this purpose, light post-editing, however you define that, is sufficient to accomplish, to meet the specifications, then that could conceivably fall under PVTQ, because what I have not, this gives me the opportunity to say something I was hoping to say. Verification includes verifying that the agreed on specifications have been met. If there were no specifications, it cannot be verified. This is also an advertisement for developing structured translation specifications. Basically, my whole career in translation, philosophy of language, computer science, everything is tied up in this. It's all coming together.
That's why you're so passionate about it, which is nice to see. But a very practical question from Sarah. How do you propose attaching a label to a translation in practice? Would it be visible, e.g. a watermark or header footer, or just somewhere in the metadata? Also, of course, some documents are never printed anymore. They're just online.
Right. This needs to be worked out. This is also going to be a headache for LTAC Global. One of the very next projects will be what's called a logo mark, which will be associated with the character mark. And in a web page that should appear, well, in a right to left language, maybe in the upper right-hand corner, and so on, but which would become a button, a live button, which would take you to more details. On a paper document, maybe a footnote, an end note up at the title. It would apply to the next one also, to the largest segment of text that falls under that same process and accountability and qualifications. So it's possible that one chapter of a document would be PVT, would be professionally verified, and another chapter would be unverified. And you'd apply the label to the largest section of the text possible.
With which you replied, I think, to Celine's question, whether the label applied to each and every segment or not. So we can maybe take the last question or comment, I guess, from Khadija before the coffee break. Qualified professional translators necessarily require some kind of linguistic competence assessment that subject specialists do not undertake. So are the boundaries between the two categories is blurred. Khadija sees a danger there, as translation is more about the transfer skills. Would you like to comment on this one?
I'm not going to comment on transfer skills because that's so theoretically loaded, but I will comment on the question of the linguistic specialist, the bilingual specialist, which is typically who's involved in revision if you're ISO 17100 oriented, and then review, which may be the subject matter specialist or subject matter SME, subject matter expert, who does not necessarily have the same linguistic skills. In this case, we see the probable evolution that the team of the reviser and the reviewer will together verify that this meets is not only corresponds, but also is subject matter proper. And sometimes it'll be an organization that says, the team we engaged, we certify that, oh no, we have verified, and we take accountability. That's going to be the big thing, isn't it? Accountability.
Good. Thank you very much, Alan, for this very passionate presentation.